Why is it that the EU is unable to leave the Sahel alone? It has been dubbed the world's poorest region. They have cautioned that it is too unstable and dangerous. Additionally, they were the first to turn away and terminate diplomatic connections when the military gained control of Burkina Faso. However, they have returned. All of a sudden, EU officials are flying into Ouagadougou, shook hands, grinned for the cameras, and had private meetings with the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso. 3 days. They stayed for that long. Attempting to patch things up took 3 demanding days. The question then becomes, why? What was different? Why is the European Union keen to strengthen ties with Burkina Faso after denouncing it as a military dictatorship? Does it have to do with power, peace, or something far more strategic? Will Burkina Faso comply, or will they remind the West that this is a new Africa that submits to no one? That is arguably the most important question. Let's get the story straight. The European Union acted quickly after Captain Ibrahim Traoré took over in Burkina Faso in September 2022. It was a rapid, loud, public, and total condemnation. They saw it as yet another military coup and a setback to Sahelian democracy. And how did they react? Dangers, caution, pledges to stop providing help if Burkina Faso didn't comply. Traoré, however, was unfazed. He didn't plead. He did not recoil. Rather, he disconnected the power. President Traoré made the audacious decision to sever all military and security ties with the European Union. As simple as that. The alarm bells in Brussels began to sound when a similar coup occurred in Niger, and the new military leader followed Traoré's example. The EU realized all of a sudden that they were losing the region as a whole, not just one nation. Now, other EU countries have chosen a different course than France. The former colonial power, often humiliated by the audacious choices of Sahelian leaders. For instance, Germany quickly joined the chorus of condemnation. Berlin halted diplomatic relations when Traoré came to power, and demanded a shift to civilian governance before re-engaging. However, time went by. Furthermore, nothing altered. Burkina Faso did not back down. The dangers, disregarded. The strain, dismissed with a shrug. Then it struck them. Traoré wasn't playing a bluff. The military had no intention of retreating. The Germans dispatched an ambassador, so casually and without much fanfare. A handshake. A discussion. An effort to re-establish the very connections they had broken. Germany wasn't the only one. Denmark came next. Next is Italy. European countries started turning around one by one, attempting to reopen doors that they had so boldly closed. Is the question though, is it a diplomatic move or despair? These countries gradually came to a silent realization. Burkina Faso didn't require them. Burkina Faso was needed by them. The European Union is now realizing that fact. The EU's special representative for the Sahel, Joël Gomes-Cravinho, stood in front of the media in Ouagadougou on May 13, 2025, following a low-key but symbolic 3-day visit. He used cautious wording in his message. However, the message was obvious. Since 2021, more than 200 billion CFA francs have been invested. That is Burkina Faso's EU footprint. They're not prepared to lose it. Cravinho referred to it as a dialogue-based collaboration. An endless conversation. A tactful expression. However, it also shows how urgent the EU is becoming to remain involved. He met with important officials when he was there. Discussions and plans were discussed behind closed doors, and he left with a message following a 72-hour encounter. The meetings were really beneficial. We have to carry on the conversation now, a conversation that never ends. As long as both parties are contributing ideas and goals, the world continues to raise this question, nevertheless. Is collaboration really the goal here? Or is it an attempt to reclaim lost power in an area that isn't awaiting authorization anymore. The message was straightforward to Joao Gomes Cravinho. He stated that there is a shared interest between Burkina Faso and the European Union, a common goal for what he referred to as win-win collaboration. He carefully considered his words as he stood in front of reporters. Similar to a man attempting to repair a brittle bridge, we are convergent. It must be a rich relationship, advantageous to all parties. In this type of collaboration, the EU ought to be viewed as a friend. However, there was an obvious undertone hidden beneath the cautious words. Control is no longer held by the European Union. It's a negotiation. Cravinho went on. This collaboration is dynamic. It adjusts to the current situation. Stated differently, Europe is adapting to a new Sahelian reality, one in which the terms are no longer set by them. His address concluded on a hopeful note. But be careful too. There is always room for improvement. We haven't arrived yet. We must continue our conversation. The partnership as a whole suffers when communication ceases. The message was sent in an instant to the rest of Europe, not simply Burkina Faso. The outdated playbook is no longer effective. Today, the Sahel is writing its own destiny, and Europe has to earn its place at the table. Let's be clear now. There was no consensus, not quite yet, due to the fact that the terminologies have evolved. The European Union held the top spot in the table for many years, imposing restrictions, regulating assistance, and establishing the definition of collaboration. Why? Because they were permitted by former Burkina Faso leaders. Corrupt, compromised, feeble. However, President Traoré, he is made of a different fabric. He's been very clear about one thing. No one still regards Burkina Faso as a subordinate nation. It is an independent country, and it insists on being handled as such. Therefore, any collaboration must be on equal footing. No more unfair agreements, no more subdued dominance, and the EU's final statement says a lot about that. According to Cravinho, for Burkina Faso to cooperate, the EU must be viewed as a friend. Here is the silent reality that lies behind those words though. They already know if the EU has to request to be considered a friend. They're not. Should that come as a surprise? Not at all. Not when Burkina Faso was experiencing upheaval, and the EU did nothing. The once a new leader opted for sovereignty over subservience, aid was frozen. We are seeing more than simply diplomacy. It's a battle to stay relevant. Europe's last-ditch effort to restore power in a region that isn't following the rules. Africa's relationship with Europe has been characterized as a partnership for more than 400 years. However, what has it actually brought about? For so many countries, including Burkina Faso, reliance, underdevelopment, and exportation. Because the partnerships were never equal for ages. They were founded on the shoulders of feeble leaders who ceded sovereignty for crumbs and catered to outside pressures. But that is the end of that age. The regulations have been altered under Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso has stopped pleading for help. It is no longer an appeal for assistance. On its own terms, it is standing. And the European Union must start with one thing if it still wishes to have a place at the table. Show respect. Lectures are over. No more demands. No more unfair agreements. The message of Traoré is unambiguous. Your subjects are not us. We are on an equal footing with you. And that is revolutionary. However, it raises an urgent question. Why is Europe so keen to re-establish connections at this time? Have they forgotten that the military controls Burkina Faso? Is the fight against insecurity still going on? Do they notice something else instead? Something changing? Africa is still portrayed in black and white by European media back home, both literally and metaphorically. Africa is poverty to the average person in Paris or Berlin. Youngsters who are starving. Roofing made of thatch. Dirt roads. Areas of conflict. The same image that was recycled. The same old story. and Europe is always at the center. The rescuer. Aid is being sent to the defenseless continent by the kind donor. However, that image is false. Burkina Faso is demonstrating this. Africa isn't waiting to be saved today. To save itself, it is rising. The entire globe is observing. Burkina Faso faces swift penalty whenever it dares to defy convention and reject the script prepared in Washington or Brussels. Help suspended. Diplomatic relations cold. Sanctions in danger. However, the European Union is now hurrying to mend ties with Burkina Faso, even though it has not returned to civilian administration and has maintained its sovereignty. The question then becomes why? What is in it for the EU? This has never been about charity, let's face it. The narrative presented in European headlines provides the impression that Africa benefits while the EU gives. However, nothing that Europe does in Africa is actually free. There is a plan and interest behind every donation, every objective, and every handshake, because what's under Africa's soil has always been the most important thing to the West. Rare earth minerals, oil, uranium, gold, and the future of world power are the fundamental foundation of contemporary industry. But resources aren't the only consideration these days. Africa's population is booming, its confidence is increasing, its geopolitical significance is rapidly increasing, and the continent is no longer the quiet partner. Africans will make up 1 in 4 of the world's population by 2050. African youth will make up 1 in 3 of the world's youth. And the foundations of international diplomacy are being rocked by that reality. Any nation that does not have a positive relationship with Africa will lose its relative position in the global economy, stated Michael Tancham of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And that's the main point of this. In a world where Africa is a power rather than a pawn, the European Union is working to preserve its relevance going forward, not merely to preserve a partnership. Because of this, the European Union and its member states are currently engaged in a silent grace, a rush to strengthen relations with Africa, because they secretly know something that they almost ever acknowledge. Europe's rise was fueled by Africa, its cheap resources, and its stolen labor. Europe's empires were created in Africa. Its industrial renaissance was driven by Africa. Modern Europe is a product of Africa. The world is currently on the verge of change once more. Once again, Africa is the center of attention, but there's a question this time. Will Africa once more serve as a building block for other civilizations, leaving its own people behind? This isn't the Africa of the past, that much is clear. Africa today is brave, self-assured, and prepared. One-sided collaborations are rapidly disappearing. Due to colonization, Europe was previously Africa's first ally. Today, it is in competition. No longer assured, no longer privileged. Because Africa has choices now. China has arrived. Russia has arrived. Turkey, the states of the Gulf. And Africa is making a decision for the first time in contemporary history. No longer constrained by history or guilt. Not reliant on former allies who give terms rather than appreciation. African leaders of today are paving a new course. One that centers on what's best for Africa rather than on past colonial overlords. What about Europe? It must finally accomplish what it has never done before if it hopes to be relevant and be a part of Africa's future. Consider Africa on an equal footing, because it is now possible for the continent that created the world to create its own. Something distinguishes Africa's relationship with Europe from that with countries such as China or Russia. And it's unbalanced, not just history. Europe has been speaking the language of partnership for decades. Collaboration on an equal basis. Respect for one another. Growth that is shared. But what's the truth? There was never equality. Economic pacts, aid packages, and trade agreements are all disguised as cooperation. On the inside, however, Europe consistently took more than it contributed. Always. Europe exported promises, while Africa exported raw materials. And those assurances were repeatedly betrayed. Because Europe always follows the same pattern where it wants something, whether it is strategic access, political allegiance, or resources. Make $1 billion offer, development of promise, create pictures of affluence for all. What remains, though, after the ink dries and the cameras return home? Much less than what was promised. There has been awareness of this circle of betrayed trust. Sharper and more unified, today's African leaders have begun to pose the difficult issues. Why do we consistently give the most and get the least in return? The door has opened for that reason. To Russia, to China, to any country that is prepared to view Africa as a partner rather than a charity case. Because Africa has moved on, while Europe continues to adhere to its outdated strategy of pressure and promises. Where the money comes from is no longer the only consideration. It has to do with the source of respect. Respect is also a given in the new world that is emerging. African countries put up with European domination for many years. Even as they started to form new coalitions, with China, with Russia. One foot remained in the old house. Attended the summits nonetheless. Signed the agreements nonetheless. Nevertheless, Europe was given the benefit of the doubt. However, 2020 arrived, and the pandemic came along with it. Then all of a sudden, things were different. The world went into crisis mode when COVID-19 spread over the world. Africa, however, was left waiting as vaccines quickly spread throughout Europe, North America, and Asia. Awaiting assistance, awaiting the dosages, awaiting justice. Instead, however, there was betrayal. The vaccinations were hoarded across Europe. Exports that are blocked. Additionally, many of them had already expired when they sent some. As if that weren't enough, the response was astounding when African scientists came forward, ready to create their own vaccinations. Refusal. African-made vaccinations were not recognized or given legitimacy by the European Union or the UN, as though being innovative was a luxury that only others could enjoy. As like Africa didn't deserve to save itself. It was a flash of insight, and leaders started speaking up all around the continent. Ramaphosa Cyril, Kagame Paul. Once, voices were diplomatic. Defied now. It was a straightforward message. Enough. The exploitation is enough. Stop being so paternalistic. Enough with the partnership charade. And as the annoyance boiled over, a momentous event started to happen. The initial wave of coups occurred. Mali. Burkina Faso is next. Next is Guinea. Lastly, Niger. Each one is a spark in a fire that is spreading. A continental reckoning, in addition to political upheaval. They were rejecting the old world order. In action, not at press conferences or coaches' remarks. Africa has stopped begging to be noticed. To be regarded was a tough task. What about Europe? It needed to decide. Adapt to Africa as it has changed, or fall behind. African governments were not the only ones shaken by the surge of military takeovers. Africa's connection with Europe underwent a dramatic change as a result. And France felt that shock more than any other nation. France considered itself the guardian of Francophone Africa for many years. The hand that leads. The donor. The former colonizer. Still holding on to power. However, a change was occurring. Something that cannot be undone. One sentiment became more and more prevalent throughout the Sahel as the dust settled after each coup. Fury. Fight imperialism. Fight against decades of being taken advantage of. Hate France. Furthermore, the truth was far more complex than the Western media's hasty accusation that the military juntas were disseminating anti-French propaganda. Generals weren't the source of this rage. It originated with the populace, from educators and farmers, from young people living on the streets, from a generation fed up with living in the shadow of France. African countries also looked to new partners as they turned their backs on their erstwhile colonizers. Russia, Turkey, Iran. Countries that provided infrastructure, investment, and military support without the conditional aid and moral lecturing. There was China after that. China has been making covert investments and constructing ports, roads, and hospitals for more than 10 years. Beijing's audacious wager was now at last the center of attention. That Africa's emergence was independent of Europe. Europe suddenly started to realize the unimaginable. Africa was being lost to them, and they did what desperate powers do in a rush to reclaim lost territory. A summit was called. The 2022 Europe-Africa Summit, twice postponed, cancelled earlier. Panic-stricken resurrection. A desperate attempt to patch up a relationship that had already broken down. However, the question still stood. Was it too late? Because Europe no longer believed it controlled the Africa that was seated at the table in 2022. Europe was much more enthusiastic about the 2022 summit than Africa, according to Lidit Tedesca-Schifferal, Associate Director of the European Centre for Development Policy Management. With lofty rhetoric and well-crafted pledges, European leaders flooded into the summit halls. The European Council President Charles Michel referred to it as the start of a new African-European partnership. Macron, Emmanuel, a New Deal of Africa, he called it. However, the outdated mentality persisted underneath the elaborate speeches and picture shoots. Because it became brutally obvious after the summit, not much had changed. Africa was still viewed as a resource by Europe. A chessboard for geopolitics. Instead of welcoming Africa, it's a place to keep China and Russia out. By the middle of 2022, they promised 450 million doses of the vaccine. A global Gateway Africa-Europe investment package worth 150 billion euros was launched. A package designed to combat vulnerable migration and aid in Africa's development. It sounded amazing, audacious, revolutionary. Here's the truth though. None of it has yet reached Africa. No immunizations, not billions. Nothing new. Just more assurances. More delays, that's all. More of the same, really. Therefore, a large number of African politicians are no longer waiting for Europe to deliver, whether they are in the halls of Ouagadougou or on the streets of Bamako. Because Africa has discovered a harsh reality. You don't rise in this world by relying on other people. You get up by standing up for yourself. Africa is now standing. The European Union's president visited Nairobi, Kenya, in 2023. Not for exchange, not for the sake of diplomacy, but for the climate summit in Africa, with a fresh message, as well as an outdated agenda. They arrived with a proposal, a plan to work together to combat climate change. However, that offer left many African leaders with a bad taste in their mouths. Because Europe pillaged, exploited, and extracted minerals, oil, and gas for decades, plucked from the dirt of Africa, to support the industrialization of Europe. Cities in Europe were developed with the wealth of Africa. Its factories were powered, illuminated its streets. Additionally, it contributed to global warming. The issue of climate change has now spread over the world. However, it is not an African crisis. Africa suffers the most even though it accounts for less than 5% of global emissions. The very soil that Europe formerly benefited from is now being scorched by droughts, floods, crop failures, and rising temperatures. That's not the purpose though. This is the point. The West and Europe had their opportunity. To become what they are now, they exploited the riches of Africa. Developed, industrialized, strong. And now, as Africa is ready to create, develop, and rise with its own resources, the rules shift. They now claim that a green transition is necessary. Fossil fuels must remain in the ground, they argue now. They now argue that Africa shouldn't industrialize in the same manner as they did. Isn't that practical? Isn't that biased? Because what fairness is it for Africa to be told that it must rely on solar panels and borrowed wind when Europe could establish empires by burning coal and pumping oil? What sort of collaboration requires one party to forgo its future, to mend a past that wasn't even caused by it? In this tale, Africa is not the antagonist. The victim is the one currently attempting to write a new chapter. Furthermore, Africa will not request permission this time. It's true, indeed. On the continent, there are still some weak and avaricious leaders. However, something is changing. African leadership is emerging in a new generation. Tanzanian, Namibian, and Botswana leaders, as well as the original members of the AES group. They are demonstrating that strong, patriotic, and unabashedly African leaders are possible in Africa. They no longer merely react. They have high expectations. They are also aware of the stakes. They are aware of climate change. Close to home, because their people are the ones who are most affected by a crisis that they did not cause. Thus, they do agree. There must be a shift to green energy. Is the reality, though. Transitioning from nothing is impossible. Since your economies haven't even been permitted to industrialize, how do you go green? When there was no construction of the factories, when your infrastructure was abandoned, but your resources were stolen. Europe is back now. Not for oil or gold this time, except for lithium, cobalt, minerals of rare earths, the very things that will drive the next industrial revolution in Europe. Africa is the key to the world's desired green future. You see, the minerals are there, the workforce, the possibility. In this new transformation, Europe now aspires to be Africa's first partner. But what does that actually mean, you ask? Because centuries of exploitation, oppression, and extraction resulted from Europe's previous role as Africa's first partner. This new pledge to be green, it has a familiar scent. Saving the world isn't the only goal. The goal is to set up Europe for supremacy in the upcoming global economy. Africa is once more being viewed as a treasure rather than a partner. Furthermore, this green revolution may end up being just another chapter in the same old tale if African leaders are not watchful. However, it's possible that Africa will write the conclusion this time. And for that very reason, African leaders need to exercise caution. It's time to negotiate from a position of power now that Africa is once again in the forefront of international attention, and that its resources, youth, and future are viewed as essential to the globe. No more unfair agreements, empty promises are no longer acceptable. It's time to end partnerships that exploit Africa under the guise of cooperation. Africa is rising, and with that rise comes a rare opportunity to shape the continent's future on its own terms, perhaps more than ever before in modern history. But this can only happen if Africa's leaders have the courage to reject exploitation and stand firmly for sovereignty, equality, and dignity. This moment isn't just about diplomacy, energy, or environmental concerns. It's about legacy. Will Africa finally reclaim what is rightfully hers? What do you think? Is Africa truly ready to lead rather than follow? Share your thoughts in the comments below.